Right, so good afternoon, everybody. I know it's like super late in the day and everybody's like, whoa. After the party last night, and it's a Saturday, and you can like literally be anywhere but here, so I really appreciate that you guys chose to be here with me. Like Tim was saying, I'm a UNO graduate. I'm kind of a local yokel, and I've been around for a bit over 20 years now, and there's quite a few faces I recognize out here, so it's kind of exciting too. A lot of people I haven't seen in like almost 20 years, so it's neat. So I'm currently working for Nebraska Furniture Mart. You guys know the Mart, you know, and everything. No, don't ask for the friends and family discount. I'm not giving you all my info. So, but I do have a quick question first. Did anybody else get a pandemic pet? Or was it just me? Okay, it's not just me. So I was stuck like all summer at home with my son, who was 12 at the time, and he couldn't go to summer camp anymore because of COVID. And so we decided to get pet rats. Because, I mean, like, I'm a security professional who doesn't like rats, right? So these are the rats. This is embarrassing because I probably have more rat pictures on my phone now than I have pictures of my kids. And I'm trying to convince the kids to let me name them stuff like Ghost Rat and Sub-7, Netbus, Poison Ivy. And I do highly recommend rats as pets, and they make excellent coworkers compared to some people I've worked with. Not anybody in the room, I promise. And they'll work for peanuts, like literally. So, in reality, I'm here to tell you the tale of shitty NAC. And I apologize for the profanity, and I don't see any kids in here, but if your kids are anything like my kids, they've probably heard worse. But by the time we get to the end of this, I think you'll appreciate how it earned the name. During yesterday's keynote, Joe was talking about hacking and how some people don't consider hacking to be part of information security. But if you've done security engineering long enough, you've probably had to hack something together. And I've always considered shitty NAC to be a hack. I'm going to mention some like specific security products. This is not a sales pitch. I can give you recommendations, but I'm not here to sell anything because this is a principle, right? You can implement this with any security product that you want, and you can do it in your environment or you can play around with it. I might throw out some acronyms that you're not familiar with. If you're not sure, write it down. I'll define some of them, but I tend to just throw stuff out. So hit me up and ask me if you're not sure about something. So first off, we had our scenario. We had a pen test coming. That's a fun place to be, right? We knew the attackers would, among other things, find their way into the building, and we absolutely knew that they would find a way to get on the network and try to leverage it to set up command and control and access other systems. How did we know this? It's what they did the last time they pen tested us. It was about 1.5 years before this test. And that test was not long after I had started working there, and I had no idea what I was getting into, let me tell you. But we had made some great strides in improving our security posture. We deployed two-factor authentication, all of our public-facing stuff, which you guys should already be doing, right? You guys are already doing it. We talked about this like twice today, so you're going to do it. And we were kind of excited to see if that would limit their attack vectors. But I feel like getting into the building and sneaking around unnoticed is something that red teams like to hang over your head in the outbrief, like, hey, we were in the building, we were doing stuff with you guys, and you didn't even know it. So I totally expected these guys to pull it again. We also knew that this pen test would take place within the next few months. I didn't know the exact date, and I didn't want to know the exact date because I like testing my IR processes and I love surprises. But I don't like being owned, so it was time to sit down and figure out how to catch them. So where do we start? I'm going to start with wireless security just because this was a little bit easier for us. And while it is definitely not perfect, I was not at the time super concerned with our wireless networks. For starters, it's really easy to keep people off your wireless network if you have the vaguest idea of what you're doing. And if you don't, talk to the vendor who sold you the system and they will help you out. All you have to do is force people to authenticate before they can connect. Also, WPA has been around for almost 20 years now. And if you're not using WPA2 AES or WPA3 instead of WEP, you need to have a come to Jesus talk with your network administrator. So as far as authentication goes, you can use pre-shared keys, captive portals with user authentication, better. And my personal favorite, 802.1x. all of which have been baked into wireless access points and operating systems for years, and they are pretty straightforward to configure and use. You could also get a NAC for your wireless networks, but we're going to cover that later. The best way to secure a wireless network is to not have one, but your laptop users are going to complain. So if you want to let them connect to your production network so they can work, leverage your internal PKI to deploy certificates automatically to domain joining systems and have them use 802.1x. Why not use a pre-shared key? Because someone's going to write it down, and if they do, your pen testers are going to find it. And they're going to find that along with all the passwords that they have stashed under their keyboards and in their desk drawers and everywhere else. So you could be in a building of 5,000 people, and the one person who wrote it down, that's the one they're going to find. I'm telling you. So the other downside to that is your user might use it to put personal devices on the internal network, and you don't want that either. Certificates make switching wired and wireless networks pretty seamless for your users, and you get closer to using 802.1x on your wired networks, and it's safer, so just get it done, like the bullet. I don't think I need to say this to this crowd, but keep your guest Wi-Fi firmly separated from production and validate it on a regular basis, just in case someone makes a stupid change or tries to sneak something past you. If you want your users to have the option to connect to a Wi-Fi network with their personal phones or tablets while they're at work, I mean, that's totally fair. Set up a staff network for it and use Active Directory as authentication to access it. Why do I want to use AD? Because if they're going to try to do something sneaky on the guest Wi-Fi, I want to know who's doing it. I'll discourage them from trying to use it to do stuff they're not supposed to be doing. We actually had a staff and a guest network, and they had different authentication requirements. If you wanted to get on the guest network, you actually had to send a request to a sponsor internally. They would get the password and then give it to you, and then you could get on the guest Wi-Fi. This is not practical everywhere. I work for the Mart. You get free Wi-Fi at the Mart. I can't stop you. But if you work for an organization like that, it still doesn't hurt to have a password somewhere. Just kind of keeps the riffraff off your network. Make sure you've got it, your web content filter in place. Nobody's trying to do anything naughty. And last there, make sure you set up your rogue wireless access point detection. It is built into most wireless access systems, so you can get alerts if someone plugs a wireless switch or router into your internal network. It might involve setting up a little bit of extra infrastructure, but it is very useful for finding bad guys and lazy sysadmins. So at this point in our story, all this wireless security stuff is done. I know there's probably some other things that I could cover here, but I don't have all day. So I'm not worrying much about wireless. The wired network is a totally different story. How do you stop people from just walking into your building and plugging into any open port? For starters, you can have proper physical security to keep intruders out. It's not always an option, but it is a good start. I said I work for the Mart. We have all this stuff on the floor. It's wonderful to try to secure. But if you work for an organization that does have a guard at the front desk, it's still something you can use. It also won't stop dumb users from doing dumb things like bringing their PlayStation to work because their home internet is slow and they really want to download Call of Duty. But it does at least help keep mean attackers out of your office until they figure out your keycard system has a serious vulnerability and they clone keycards. So next step here we have disable all of our unused ports. You should do this anyway, but again, it's not 100% effective because anybody can just unplug something that's already got an active port, like an idle conference room PC or something, and plug their device in. So how do I address that? You use port security, or something like Cisco sticky ports if you're a Cisco person. Basically, you're assigning a MAC or MACs to a port and anyone else that connects to it is blocked. Managing it will make your network administrators cry, but it is very effective. We actually did this in publicly accessible parts of the office because our vendors would come in for presentations and they would unplug the conference phone to plug their laptop into the network instead of just using the guest Wi-Fi like normal people. A similar option to that is using assigned DHCP. You configure your DHCP server to look at the MAC address of the system requesting the lease, and you assign it a static IP based on that request. Yeah, that's not fun to manage either. I would only recommend that if you're in like a very secure, high-risk environment, because the overhead of managing it is obviously very, very high. And if you really want to make your network admins cry, you could do that and port security at the same time, and they'll hate you for the rest of your life. And we have 802.1x, of course. Now we're talking, except we're not talking if your network device doesn't support authentication, but that's why you want a NAC. So what is a NAC? Gartner defines network access control as technologies that enable organizations to implement policies for controlling access to corporate infrastructure by both user-oriented devices and Internet of Things devices. Policies may be based on authentication, endpoint configuration, or user's role or identity. NAC can also implement post-connection policies based on integration with other security products. Once you get past that marketing speak, what does this really mean? So let's make an analogy. You walk up to the front door of the club, and the NAC is the bouncer that tells you if you're going to be let in or not. He might look at your ID and make sure you match the picture, and you on the list to get in the club. Do you know the secret word to get in? And that's kind of like 802.1x. It's authenticating you before you can get in. He might just look you over, and if you meet the dress code, are you over the age of 21? That's kind of like device profiling before he lets you in. He might even give you a chance to clean up before you're let in. No shirt, no shoes, no service, right? That's kind of like being in a remediation VLAN. Or maybe you're let into the club, but you aren't on the VIP list, so you don't get full access to the building. That's kind of like using a user identity-based policy to restrict access to your production servers if you're not an admin. Or maybe you're just too pumped to your own good and they kick you out entirely. On the technical side, what it's really doing is evaluating your system based on a set of profiles, assigning you to a VLAN with an ACL, defining what other networks you're allowed to access, and doing so dynamically on a port-by-port basis. That VLAN may not allow access to anything. It may allow you full access to the internal network. It just depends on how you set up the policy. A NAC can be super aggressive, and you might require full access to the operating system to perform a compliance scan or an agent on every endpoint. This can be used to screen for systems that don't meet patching or AV requirements, like your home laptop user that hasn't installed any patches for a few months. They might pass the authentication phase, but they're not going to pass the compliance scan. And you would put them on a remediation VLAN with like access to your SIEM server or WSS, whatever you're using, or to the internet to get updates before you let them on production. Or maybe they're one of those users and they disabled AV, and it needs to be re-enabled in a scan run before they can connect to the network. This sort of thing can actually be useful for reducing risk in environments where you have contractors or consultants bringing in their own systems that aren't on your domain and they're not subject to your security policies. And management is basically forcing you to let them connect to the internal network to complete work. And I saw this all the time with developers at one place where I worked, and we actually got a really bad configure infection from a consultant with a compromised laptop. Yeah, and it turned out that the one guy missing the patch for it was a DBA. That was not a fun day. But if we had had a NAC, we could have forced some compliance scanning and reduced that risk if we were going to let somebody else onto our network. So we touched on device profiling. What is device profiling? It's the main reason why you want a NAC and you're not just going to roll out 802.1x everywhere, because there's a lot of dumb devices on your network and they don't know how to authenticate. So you need some way to tell the NAC that they meet the dress code and they can be let in the club. To do this, you end up analyzing all the stuff on your network, collecting network attributes, comparing them to profiles. Some of these are going to be built in the system, some of them are going to be custom made. And then you set up rules to determine if a device that matches that profile gets access to anything, and if so, what does it get access to? A good chunk of device profiling is things like checking your device's MAC address against a vendor list. They'll run NNAC with OS detection. I've seen this. They'll check like port probe responses for things like version numbers, like is it running SSH, is it running HTTP, it'll gather information on that. And it'll watch the network traffic coming from the system to look for stuff like user agent strings. So like if my system's firewalled off pretty well, but it's sending traffic to the internet, I can still use that information to profile it. It's not magic, and don't believe any vendor that tells you they've got some like magic, wonderful NAC, because they all involve some work. The main difference is going to be how many device profiles they recognize by default and how many you probably have to create yourself, and how difficult that process is. Thanks, Cisco. There's also gotchas. And this is my favorite because this happens all the time. I'm building a new system, and it's not domain joined yet, so it doesn't have a certificate. But to join the domain, it has to be on the network. To get on the network, it has to authenticate with a certificate. But I don't want to use a device profile because I might let a bad guy plug his laptop in instead of Joe Techie building a new system. So what do I do now? So you find these like edge cases and you start to deploy this stuff, and it never ends. So back to our scenario, what are my options for finding and stopping the bad guys here? So I was like really initially excited because I knew our networking team was heavily invested in ICE, and deploying it on the wired network was on their roadmap. They already had it on the wireless network, they had everything set up and configured, and it was really cool and wonderful. So I'm like, hey, we have 802.1x switches everywhere. That's a challenge. If you look for a place that's really cheap and they don't have switches that support 802.1x, there's no NAC. So you can't do that. We had the internal PKI with certificates on every device that could have one. I just had to convince them to start the device profiling and set up monitoring. But our networking team had a heart of gold and feet of lead. And they had no intention of even looking at this for 6 months. They wanted to hire consultants to help them out. And there was no way we were going to get it rolled out, much less start blocking. Probably, for a year or more, just because they wanted lots of time for device profiling. So ICE is out. What other options do I have? Do I purchase a better NAC solution? No. I don't have a snowball's chance in hell of getting budget approved and something purchased and deployed in 3 months. That's just not happening. I could make networking use port security on all the ports. Only if I wanted to get shoved in a comms closet and beaten with bars of soap and tube socks. If they didn't have time to roll out wired ICE, they weren't going to do port security for me. If I can't protect, can I at least detect? Did we have other options like endpoint-based rogue system detection? No. But if you have a product that does it, it is very effective at finding rogues. In a past life, I had used McAfee for rogue system detection, and it was very simple to set up and monitor your network, and we found lots of unwanted systems and people doing bad stuff. So it's any sort of endpoint-based system might support this at this point. There's new ones. I think even like Tanium will do it. Like a Defender for Endpoint, like Microsoft's kind of gradually starting to roll some of that in there. So take a look at what you have, because even if it didn't have it before, it might have it now. And I can give up, but that's not an option because, like I said, I don't like being owned. So what's next? If I can't prevent them from connecting to my network, what can I do to detect that they've done so? And maybe what can I do to slow them down long enough for me to find them and kick them off the network? So let's talk about the SIEM, Security Information and Event Management. Why do you need a SIEM? Well, because I cannot prevent every attack. I have to detect every attack. You absolutely need centralized logging. You need the means to analyze the logs, to detect attacks, analyze them, accurately determine the scope and extent of a breach so you can make the correct response. If you have an incident of any sort and you bring in a third-party IR team to assist with you, the very first thing they will ask you for is all the logs. So what kind of logs do we collect? Well, you start with your domain controller logs. Make sure it includes directory services and any other services running on your DC. But you don't have any other services running on your DC, right? Right? Yeah. Firewall logs, that's pretty obvious. Proxy and web content filter logs, not just for pen tests, but when for HR pulls you aside and asks you to take a look at somebody's browsing history. DNS logs are super important, but they are tricky and they are high volume, super high volume, but you must have them. Figure out how to get them into your SIEM, because if you're sitting there going, okay, well, how many systems are infected with this thing? Okay, well, I can look in the firewall logs and see network connections, but that doesn't tell me what DNS, like what host is necessarily behind them and how many systems, or like if you've got Zeus, right? And it's using rotating domain names, I can look at those for patterns. So, like I said, it hurts, but do it. VPN logs, obviously. Anything cloud, like your federated identity services, your Azure AD or your Okta logs, make sure those are in there too. I could go on for days. This is my thing. So, SIEMs. With great amounts of data comes great amounts of cost. And if you're using something like Splunk, you're paying for every single bit of that data. Yeah, I'm a QRadar fan. You keep it in your EPS, it's gold. But Splunk is really good too. But if you're already using something, that's fine. You don't need to go out and buy a new product. Just learn to use yours better, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to SIEMs. Take Elk, for example. I don't know if any of you have used Elk before to try to collect logs, but it is just miserable because it's free until you buy all the infrastructure, like with the servers and everything to try to ingest all the data coming into it, and then you gotta hire like 2 or 3 people that can try to manage it and handle all the parsing and fix it when it breaks, and by the time you do all that, you may as well have just bought a real SIEM. So getting a SIEM is a worthy investment regardless of how you get it done. And if your goal is to detect and stop a breach, this is the absolute first place to start. A good SIEM, and this is where Elk also sucks, by the way, it doesn't just collect data, it'll fire alerts or run scripts based on activity and let you create custom alerts for your environment. So we actually got our SIEM after that prior pen test where they just completely killed us. And getting it deployed and all the log sources into it was kind of my baby. And I live for the logs. Everything that I listed, I had it all in there. Our MSSP was mad at me because I wanted the DNS logs and I didn't want to write the parser for it, and I made him do it anyway. So I had it all. And I also had DHCP. And what is DHCP? It is something that basically every organization uses for handing out IP addresses on the network. Aha, let's step back a second. What is a NAC doing? It's basically just doing DHCP's job for it, except it's authenticating or profiling a device before it gives you the IP address. So if I'm walking into your building looking for a good time on your network, I can't connect to the network without an IP address. And I can't just give myself a static IP without knowing a fair amount about the target network first, which if I'm pen testing, I might have a lot of info, I might not. But I need to know where my DNS servers are. I need to know my default gateway. I need to know that I'm not giving myself an IP that's not already being used by somebody. Because what happens when you take an IP that's already being used by somebody? Yeah, you don't have a fun time. Has anyone ever had to chase down like a rogue device on the network handing out IP addresses? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. That is not a fun time. So if I'm doing a pen test, just plugging in and letting DHCP do all the hard work for me is going to let me do some reconnaissance while I'm at it, and I get all that info for free and maybe even some information about your proxy. So that can be useful. So let's talk about DHCP. What are in the DHCP logs? And this is not pretty, because it's kind of this like gross syslog format with tabs, and you just blame Microsoft for this because it's just, this is why you buy a good SIEM, so it parses all this crap for you, like out of the gate. So I've got a timestamp, I've got a server name, I got some information about it, and I have the IP address that was assigned to the system. I have a host name, depending on what that system's name is. That can be changed, it might not exist, but if you see something that looks a little fishy, it's probably a little fishy. I have a MAC address, which is the physical hardware address of the system. This is important. And I have some vendor info, but don't count on that. I was actually surprised when I found this one because I did not expect to see that in there, because usually you don't see any vendor info at all. So let's talk about MAC addresses, and not like Mac laptops, we're talking about the other Mac. A MAC address is pretty static. You can change it, you can do all sorts of stuff with it, but it still needs to be unique on the network, just like an IP address. And better yet, like the first 6 characters can be used to identify the vendor or manufacturer of the network adapter, which will help you figure out just what plugged into your network. So I'm looking at the DHCP logs, and I go, if I know all of the good MAC addresses on my network, then I just need to look at new DHCP requests, and if it's a MAC address I don't already know about, it's a bad guy, right? Okay. This is where we started from, but it actually ended up being a little more complicated than that. So, building a MAC list. Technically, I don't know about any MAC addresses, and I don't have time to sit there and pour through DHCP logs to build a list. So, how do I shortcut my way to a list of all the good MAC addresses on my network? I have asset management. I talked to my endpoint management people, and they went digging through SIEM and gave me a list of all the MAC addresses. That's a good chunk of your network right there, and it also includes devices that might not be plugged in at the moment, like laptops that people are using at home. So it doesn't get you all your IP or your MAC addresses, but it's a good start, and pretty much any endpoint manager should have this information. So my next question was to the networking team. What are we using for network management? Can you give me an inventory of every Mac currently connected to the network? So Cisco Prime did that job for us, and it worked out really well. So they just dumped all the MAC addresses, gave it to me, saved me so much time. So there's like a gotcha here too, because if you already have an attacker on your network, you're not starting from a secure baseline. And if you already have an attacker on your network, you've got bigger problems than building a NAC. So you do need to be in a state where you can reasonably trust everything on your network. And if you come up dry on some of this stuff, talk to people in the infrastructure teams. They're usually willing to help you out if you've got a problem like this, because they like the challenge. So make some friends and ask around if you're trying to find Macs. So I have my DHCP logs parsed in my SIEM. I have a list of known good Macs. So I build a reference set of good Macs, and I build a rule that looks something kind of like this. If it's a new DHCP lease request, look at the MAC address. If it's not in the list of good Macs, send me an alert. Boom, all done, problem solved. Pack it up, go home. Nope. It is not that easy. So we had problems. I found out that when VMs reboot, VMware likes to give them a new MAC address. Yeah, and networking infrastructure was building new servers all the time, and I've got to exclude those. I actually really would rather the server administrators not use DHCP for the servers. I would rather have static IPs on them, but that was a battle I lost really fast. And I mean, honestly, depending on your data center security, you can probably exclude most of your server IP ranges. But if you've got problems with people walking into your data center and like plugging rogue hardware in, you've got more problems than a NAC can solve. Other problems, new hardware. I needed to exclude the VLAN where desktop support built new systems, which was at least in a pretty, it was in a tightly controlled space when they actually followed the rules and built stuff on there, which they didn't all the time. I also needed to exclude devices like printers and phones, and for those, I was able to use those first 6 characters in the MAC address to kind of fingerprint devices on my own and say, all right, here's a bunch of vendor IDs I know about. These are these are probably going to be okay. I also needed to update my good MAC list automatically with the new good addresses. Obviously, if something turns out to be bad, I have to manually remove that from my good MAC list, but it beats manually adding every new MAC, which we had plenty of still. So version 2, if it's a new DHCP release request, and if it's not in the server IP ranges, and if it's not where desktop support those new systems, and if the MAC doesn't look like one of ours, and if it's not on the list of good MACs, then fire an alert. And regardless, add the MAC to the list of good MACs. So now I have fewer alerts, but I don't know where they're coming from. Our VLANs were assigned by floor, so it was pretty easy to say what floor a system's on, but our floors were large, and they were broken into like multiple office spaces, and of course there wasn't any sort of useful thing like a networking diagram that matched the switch port locations to the actual floor and the cubicles, so it was not easy to figure out where the device was actually plugged in. So with my SIEM, I built a script to call the Cisco Prime API to get the switch port info, which then the networking team could use to tell me where on the floor the device was plugged in. But the lack of documentation and dealing with them directly was just, it was a very slow process. It was very manual. It was very inefficient. But did we catch anything while we were testing? Sort of, because like true positive like rogues were pretty rare on our network. We had things pretty well restricted. We did catch things like smart TVs on the network once in a while, occasionally like a personal laptop or something somebody brought from home. We got the PlayStation, but at least was enough to prove to us that it did more than just generate false positives, which is what it did 98% of the time. So it took a bit of tweaking, but by the end of the week we had a NAC, sort of. So what do we call it? And as the creator, I gave it a clever acronym and told management it was called SNAC, Simple Network Access Control. So we called it Shitty NAC because it was a shitty NAC. And I know what you're thinking, Megan, this is not a NAC. I know, that's why it's a shitty NAC. Well, in the terrible false positive rate, so yeah. But it's reactive, not proactive. There is no control in shitty NAC. And it's not going to stop anyone. A patient skilled attacker could probably still figure out a way to subvert it. And worse, I'm relying on my analysts to, 1, see the alert, and 2, do something about it quickly. Because if they don't, it's totally not going to stop an attacker from being on my network long enough to collect data and launch some attacks. Especially if it's a pen test and they show up after hours. I might come in the morning and be like, well, that was wonderful, and it didn't work. So what else could I do to slow down an attacker and buy some time once they're on the network? This brings us to my favorite, the web content filter / proxy, where I had 2 policies implemented that you should all seriously consider whether you are building a shitty NAC or not. Step 1, block all uncategorized websites. You will end up with a number of emergency change requests because HR set up a new website with a custom URL with a vendor for some benefit stuff, and they emailed that address to everyone in the company without checking to see if it worked. That was a fun morning. But there's also a good chance that an attacker's command and control will not be categorized, or it will have a less reputable categorization. So some web content filters have a newly seen domain purgatory, and they'll just throw any new domain in. It'll see it, it'll process it, and they'll go, put it on the new domain list, and it'll just bake there for like 48 hours before it automatically falls off. Some also have kind of like a middle category that means I checked it out, I don't have enough information to categorize this website because there's not really anything there. Block that too. It also works good for like advertising. So a lot of advertising sites like they're not interactive, and so when they try to do the domain check, they don't know what it is, and they'll throw, like if you want to block ads, block those sorts of domains too, and that'll help you out. I mean, it's possible that you'll be dealing with a pen tester that has spent a lot of time setting up domains and improving their reputation. And I'm probably like giving some of y'all hints right now here, like writing this, I'm like, yeah, reputation, make sure I check that. But there's also a good chance they won't. They're on a timeline too, right? So it's It's possible also that they'll figure out what content filter you're using and they'll try to get the website categorized in it. That's what our pen testers tried. And I will admit that looking through the proxy logs and like following what they were doing and seeing them like put in the request to Blue Coat was really kind of funny. But it slowed them down, and that's what's the most important thing. Blocking uncategorized and new sites is also great for stopping malware in general, even if you don't have a pen test. So do it. It will save your butt at some point. It has saved my butt many times. I promise it will pay off. Step 2, do not allow access to the internet without an identity. Basically, every firewall/web content filter supports different methods for determining a user identity from an IP address, and then basing the policy on the person and not the IP. And there's a lot of ways to get user identity. Most of them will do things like they'll put an agent on your domain controller and they'll watch the domain controller logs, because when you authenticate to the domain controller, it sends your IP address along with your username information. So it goes, oh, this IP is Megan, give Megan this policy, off we go. You can also use browser-based authentication. You can base the authentication like the user appearing on things like cookies instead of IP addresses. You can use captive portals as like a fallback for devices that can't otherwise authenticate to the proxy but might also not be on the domain. And you can run agents on terminal servers if you have multiple users behind those to help separate your user identities out there. So how does this stop attackers? Malware in general is pretty crap about giving out an identity. It's not going to know what to do with the captive portal. It's not likely to have user credentials available to authenticate against the proxy. And it's probably not going to have the logic built into it to do that. Theoretically, it could scrape like the browser's information for cookies and try that, but I haven't seen any do that yet. That might be kind of a clever trick if it can, but it relies on using the cookie-based authentication and not just IP-based. So it's, in general, it will stop malware just dead in its tracks because it does not know how to provide an identity to your proxy. And if you're a bad person putting something on my network and I don't allow access to the internet without the identity, and you don't have one yet, you're not going to get your command and control set up until you figure out how to get through the proxy. And that buys me time. But just like blocking uncategorized websites, this one comes with a little fun operational overhead. Servers are not logged in too often, but they still need access to the internet for a variety of reasons, like providing telemetry to Microsoft all the time. I found out that our Cisco switch licensing requires a connection to Cisco all the time now. Thanks, Cisco. The firewalls need access to the internet. They are downloading IPS updates. They are sending executables or PDFs or whatever to services like Wildfire or something. They need internet access. They don't know how to get through a proxy though. And then there's like really basic stuff like printers, right? Postage stamp machines, that one got me. They didn't know how to talk to the proxy and they got blocked. So if you're gonna do this, be smart about it. Look at your logs. Find out what's talking to the internet that doesn't have an identity attached and start building your whitelist of servers or URLs or whatever first before you put this in practice, because if you turn on blocking and it shuts down a bunch of production crap, you're going to get roasted, they're going to take it away, and you're never going to get to put it back. So plan first, please. So all of this was done in time for our pen test. And they put it to the proverbial test. So did it work? As I already mentioned, our key cards were cloned and our pen testers were able to get in the building and walk around and be one of us. They joined us for an IT appreciation barbecue, which almost got them busted because our CIO literally knew every single person in IT. And he sees these two rogues walking around and he's like, these like contractors or something? Where are these guys coming from? So he's trying to make his way through the crowd to them and they see him like homing in on them and they're like, we're gonna scooch out of here. So they almost got busted by him. While they were roaming the building and doing their pen testing thing, they found an empty training room and they unplugged one of the PCs and plugged their stuff into the network. And we got an alert from the NAC. And while they had access to the internal network, all they really tried to do was set up their command and control. So this kind of saved us a little bit because the lack of user identity stopped them like right in their tracks, and they just gave up. Maybe they were afraid of getting caught like alone in the training room or something. I'm not sure, but they didn't try to scan or do anything else because they did have unfettered access to our internal network. So, you know, we tried to track them down. We were too slow. By the time we got there, they had already moved on, and we didn't catch them immediately. But this is why you have the logs, because I could see what they tried to do. So I looked at my firewall, my proxy logs, my DNS servers. I saw what websites they were trying to access to set up their command and control. And I could set up monitoring for those domain names, and I could block in the proxy them trying to access it again. I couldn't block in DNS. Being able to block in DNS is really nice. You have to black hole, but it's kind of crazy, and your sysadmins are like, when you try to suggest it. So I wasn't able to do that, but I did eventually get them to let me black hole stuff. So it's worth trying. So a day or so later after this initial attempt, they did get back in, and they logged into unattended user workstations and conference PCs with stolen credentials, because people like to write their passwords down and put them on their desk, even though they're not supposed to. And that got past the identity awareness, right? But the uncategorized website block was still getting them. So they tried to get the site categorized. This process obviously takes a while. So they figured out how to just bypass the proxy entirely, which is why you don't use WCCP for your web content filter, which is something I had complained about for a long time, and I got it fixed after that, but that's another story. So I started seeing the activity for the domains that they used again, and I used the DNS and the firewall logs to trace the activity back to the systems that they had gotten a hold of. And while I was doing that, I saw some new systems start with activity, and I realized that the phone call was coming from inside the building. They were still in the building with us, going from conference room to conference room, setting up their back doors on the conference room PCs. And this was really easy for them because all of our conference rooms were mostly like on the sides of the building right by the stairwell. So they could kind of pop in and out without really being noticed by anybody. Not that anybody was around that late in the day, but I was, because I'm an overachiever. So I get a hold of my boss, and I'm like, they're in the building, oh my God. And so he calls the front desk, and we had a guard, and he's like, you guys don't let anybody out of the building. And he's like, who the hell are you? Why are you telling me this? Pretty much. So he fights with the guy at the front desk, like, just don't let anybody out of the building. I'm coming down there right now. I will be there, just please don't let anybody out. And by that point too, our pen testers were kind of getting the drift that we were picking up on them, and so they were trying to make their exit, and the guard stopped them, and my boss made it down there. And so we caught them red-handed in the building, which was a nice little trophy picture for me. I didn't get to put their heads on the wall. This was a few years ago. My hair was much shorter, and I was much happier. But I was really happy because it was the first time I caught the pen testers in the building. Because like I said, a year and a half before that, they took a picture of me from behind. It was embarrassing because I was pregnant at the time, and it's not a pretty picture anyway. And I was going to the bathroom, and they took a picture of me from the back, and it was in their report, and I was just like so humiliated because they were like, look at how we got into your stuff. So catching him in the building was really nice, and it kind of proved to management that all this investment that we had made into everything was really paying off. So, should you build your own shitty NAC? Shitty NAC is to a real NAC what piercing your ears with mom's sewing needles is to a proper piercing job. It's pretty punk, but there's better options if you're willing to pay some money. If you've got a short timeline and a SIEM and all these logs and stuff, it can definitely help you catch unwanted activity on the network, but you've got to explore other options first, please. And if you already have this SIEM, it costs nothing to get this off the ground. You should already have these log sources in your SIEM. If you don't, please get your DHCP logs in your SIEM. And building it is not going to make your security posture worse. It might eat up a lot of time chasing down false positives. I always told support that if they could find the rogue, they could keep it. So when we found the PlayStation on the network, that was like a really strong motivator for people to find it. And you know, there's ways to build a less shitty NAC. Like, I spent a lot of time over the years, like, thinking about this off and on, just like, what would I do? If I had this situation, what would I do now? And that even while I was building this slide deck, and I was like, you know what I could have done? I could have set up an alert to trigger a script to not just find the switch port that the NAC was connected to, but I could also tell Prime to disable that port. And the operational overhead on that might still be kind of high, but it's not as high as assigned DHCP or sticky ports, right? And depending on your environment and your risk tolerance and your budget, I mean, that might be an option for your own shitty NAC if you want to build one. Or it could be an opportunity for a user to shut down like half a dozen switch ports trying to connect their laptop from home like over and over. So, I mean, there's different risks, but the point is be creative. Find a new way to use a tool that you haven't considered using it before. Also, if you are looking at being pen tested soon, keep in mind that we used shitty NAC to address a very specific scenario. Our red team tried a lot of different ways to get malware on our systems and attack our users and our network. So shitty NAC is not a substitute for things like MFA, EDR, doing DNS registration monitoring for lookalike domains. Very useful. So shitty NAC is not going to save you if all you have on your site is a SIEM. So if you build one and you get owned, please don't complain to me about your shitty NAC being shitty, okay? And at the end of the day, shitty NAC died a quiet death. They got wired ice rolled out in blocking mode, and we were able to use the ice logs to find people and you know, slap them on the wrist every time they did something dumb. So I don't think anybody was sad to see it go. I know some people in this room that were part of the team at the time, and when I say things like shitty NAC, they kind of make like this face because it was like, oh God, that was so awful. So I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for shitty NAC just because it was kind of this abomination that I created, and we caught the pen testers. So, but that's the story of shitty NAC. You guys have any questions? We have plenty of time, I think. Yes, you.
Have you thought of licensing the name Shitty NAC? It's a very open source version of the Shitty NAC product.
So have I considered licensing the Shitty NAC name and creating an open source version of Shitty NAC? That's kind of tough because for starters, this is not technology dependent. You'll notice that I did use some technology names that we were using at the time, but you could do this with Splunk and whatever you're using for your networks, right? So it's kind of hard to like say this is the best way to do it. It's really more like a shitty framework to build your shitty NAC on.
So Megan, we did something very similar. We ingested our WCF logs and then flagged a custom parser for all of the uncategorized that included the identity management. So you can see the host, the identity management. Every time somebody flagged up uncategorized crap, just like that.
It is.
That was actually a pretty good output to see where people were going in this uncategorized.
Every once in a while we end up with like a vendor that stands up a new domain, and it's not categorized, and they're like, you can't get to it. And what's weird is like, because I'm not allowed to block uncategorized websites right now, and for 3 years I have been trying. I know, but we use Cisco Umbrella. And Umbrella will catch stuff pretty quickly and throw it into that newly seen domains list, and since it's cloud and everything, it updates pretty fast. So what happens instead is that these guys start using the website, and then 10 minutes later it breaks. And they can't use it anymore, they don't know why, and I get a ticket or somebody saying, why can't we get to the website? And every time it's that. So it sucks, it's kind of what I have to live with, but you're right, it's uncategorized websites are just, they're bad news every time. No identity, uncategorized website, just be done with it. Yep. All right, next. You?
So, do you think, did you give any thought to the shittiness of shitty NAC being critical in defeating the red team that you hired?
It was very important because they had done some other stuff, but it gave us a lot of insight in what they were trying to do. So without shitty NAC, I would not have known when and what they were trying to do for me to go back and look at the web content filter logs and see what domains they were trying to use to set up their command and control and to look for that in the logs later. So And I needed enough of that information because, like I said, we were using WCCP, which, yeah, Matt's making that face because, yeah, WCCP sucks. If you're using WCCP for your proxy, don't do it. Don't do it. And because once I figured out how to get around that, now I'm looking at the firewall logs and the DNS logs exclusively to catch their activity because I don't have proxy logs anymore. So ShityNet gave us some valuable intel to catch them again, because that's all it is. It's just detection. Anything else, guys? Is everybody happy? I mean, you can always hit me up. I'll be around. I'm the 5'10" chick with the purple hair, so I'm kind of hard to miss. And I will be speaking at RSA in June. So if you're going to be at RSA, come see me. It's going to be Tech 201, Building a Vulnerability Management Program, How to Eat an Elephant. It's kind of an updated version of the talk I did 2 years ago with some new information. So come and see me. Thank you.